Hey fam, welcome to season 2 of Conversations on Blessing the Flock. This is our third discussion in our ARC's 6-part summer series that looks at the directives to the exile community found in Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4 through 9. These conversations are intended to better inform and educate us as a local church on the current and historical landscape of issues as we seek to be a blessing to our community through our Pray, Study, Act teams. My name is Hannah Baker, and I have the honor of serving Anacostia River Church as Deaconess of Community Development. I hope that everyone's ready to take part in tonight's conversation, focused on efforts and trends in food production and provision in Black communities. Plant gardens and eat from them. If you are here, then please drop the hashtag plant gardens into the chat on Facebook or YouTube. This will enter you into tonight's drawing to win a signed copy of Black Food Geographies Race, Self-Reliance, and Food Access in Washington, D.C. by Dr. Ashanté Reese. Go ahead. You can do it. I see those responses coming in. Continue to use that hashtag tonight. As a reminder, this is a two-way conversation, and so please continue to use the chat to ask questions and give comments to our guests. Questions from the chat will be answered towards the end of the conversation. I'll be back later in the program to announce the winner of tonight's drawing, as well as to share about our featured resource partner. But now, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to our sister, Takor Njang. Tano is Cameroonian-born and Prince George's County, Maryland raised. She's adventurous and resourceful and Pan-African to the bone. But most importantly, she's an imperfect lover of Jesus. Fam, please show our sister Tano some love as she joins us.
Hello. Good evening. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you so much for moderating tonight.
Yeah, thank you. Just grateful that they're putting this on and I get to be a part of this. But it wouldn't be right if we don't get this session started with prayer. So I'm going to introduce to us our pastor, one of our 4 pastors here at Anacostia River Church, Pastor Babatunde Olushesi. He is raised and born in Nigeria and calls Prince George's County as well, home here in Maryland. He is a beloved father and husband to our dear Auntie Bemi. And so please, Uncle Tunde, as I call him, please bless this time so we can get started.
Thank you, Takor, for that introduction. And thank you for moderating tonight. And I also want to thank Hannah Baker, that's our Deaconess of Community Development, for putting these Bless the Block conversations together for us. We're so grateful for that. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this conversation. You're a member of ARC, you're a guest, or you just happen to be by on our YouTube channel or Facebook channel. You're welcome to this conversation. You see, just a few years ago, the Lord led us to begin to consider the instructions that God gave the people of Israel while they were in exile in Babylon, considering those instructions for our purpose as we seek to be involved in this community that the Lord has placed us, so that we can come up with implications of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The instructions God gave his people are such that will make them thrive and flourish. and not shrivel up because God has sent them into exile himself. So these instructions can be found in Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 9. And because they are going to be in exile for a long time, 70 years to be precise, God says for them to build houses and live in them, to plant gardens and eat their produce, to take wives and have sons and daughters, and give their daughters in marriage so that they can multiply and not decrease. God also says to them to seek the welfare of the city he has sent them to and pray for that city, because in the city's welfare, they will find their welfare. Lastly, God said to them to not listen to false prophets and false teachers, for they are deceiving them. So we now have taken these instructions to serve as a springboard for our own ministry drive to reach our community here where we're in. So we call this drive the PSA teams. You might be wondering, what is that? What is PSA? Okay. PSA stands for Pray, Study, and Act, which is our effort to make the gospel of Jesus Christ impactful in our community, because we are in this community for this community, spreading and sharing the grace of God. So our conversation tonight with Dr. Ashanté Reese is focused on the instruction to plant gardens and eat their produce. God is basically saying, produce your own food by yourselves so you can have plenty to eat and not go hungry, you and your children. So taking this instruction seriously, we can be self-sufficient and self-reliant in our own food production and food security. How we go about this and make growing our own food a reality in predominantly black and brown neighborhoods is what we're about to learn in this conversation with Dr. Reese. So, having said all that, let me offer a word of prayer so we can start. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time. Thank you, O Lord, that we can consider your word and use your word as an impetus to move us to be so involved in our community. You actually are the one who has shown us how important food is. Because really, without food, we cannot thrive. Neither can we flourish. And you know all this, and you have led us into this. So we pray, Father, that even as you have saved us in your grace through faith and be kind to us in every way, so also we want to show forth to our community, especially those who have not believed, though we have, that we can show mercy in this way. Gracious Father, let this discussion today, this conversation tonight, be fruitful. Let us learn indeed how we as a church can go about joining our community to see how we can produce food ourselves so that we do not go hungry. Thank you for Dr. Ashanté Reese, who has joined us in this conversation. Bless this conversation, Father. I pray all this and more in Christ Jesus' name. Takor, let the conversation begin.
Yes, now we can get started. And amen. Thank you so much, Uncle Tunde, for opening us up that way. I'm excited to be moderating this conversation, and even just the fact that it's stemmed and rooted in the Word of God. I grew up reading Jeremiah 29, and I can't say I remember going through verses 4 through 9. So this is just a great context Today, specifically talking about planting gardens and eating from them. We are talking about a time, as Uncle Today mentioned, that the Israelites were exiles, and correlating that to being exiles ourselves. As believers, we are living in this world that is not our home. We will one day be reunited with our Lord as his bride and renewed. But in the meantime, with this understanding of our shared exileship, similar to the Israelites, but different, we want to be exiles who engage, who serve, and partner with the community for its thriving. So it will be important for us to frame our conversation today. We're going to hear several statistics, which are true, but we should remember statistics don't tell a full story, but rather provide data points with various storylines behind them. Ultimately, I would like us to think of abundance rather than scarcity, and dreaming rather than limitations. The mission of the Food Security Pray Study and Act Team, which we say PSA, is to foster self-sufficient, God-dependent options for food security for our church and community. My goal this evening is to walk away with resources that will help guide our prayer, studying, and acting in the realm of food security for our church and community. Just a few terms for us to think about as we go through this beautiful Black Food Geographies and Black Food Matters. We'll be pulling some things from there. Some terms that may come up, and there might be others, and we'll define them as we go. But we'll hear things like food insecurity, which is the lack of access at times to enough food for an active, healthy life for all household members. Food desert, a geographical area where people have limited access to foods, when they have to walk more than half a mile to get groceries, when 40% of households don't have transportation, when the median income is 185% the poverty level, the household income of a household for five being about $45K a year. Once our median income here was $35,000 a year. So just putting that into perspective. And the last term I think would be really helpful is food apartheid. Food apartheid is a system of segregation that divides those with access to an abundance of nutritious foods and those who have been denied that access due to systemic injustice. With that framing, let's jump right into it. I have the esteemed pleasure to discuss with Dr. Ashanté Reese, who is the author and PhD, who has written the two books that I showed us, Black Food Geographies, Race, Self-Reliance, and Food Access in Washington, D.C., and a co-editor to Black Food Matters, Racial Justice in the Wake of Food Injustice. Dr. Ashanté Reese earned a bachelor's in history with a minor in African American studies from Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. After undergrad, she taught middle school at Coretta Scott King Leadership Academy before burnout, and that helped guide her to graduate school. Subsequently, she earned her PhD in anthropology from American University. Her interest in Black geographies, the ways Black people produce and navigate spaces and places in the context of anti-Blackness. Her pursuit is inextricably linked to the historical Black community that we are a part of here in Anacostia, who are, I would say, the second largest living people here after the indigenous people of this land. So welcome, Dr. Ashanté Reese.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I was thinking through the whole beginning of this. I think you all might be the first church who has invited me. So even when I was supposed to be halfway across the world, that's why I said yes, because I think it's just really important that churches and ministries are involved in this work. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for writing the books and doing all the research. So it's a pleasure even to have your voice. I had that in like my thank you. Your voice in this space is important. And so even to jump right in, you are not originally from the Anacostia area. So can you just tell us where you're from and what really intrigued you to write and study about this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I am from a small town in rural East Texas that no one ever knows about, but it's called Crockett. And so I grew up in a community of people who, sometimes, especially younger generations, were like, back then people used to do these things. Like, I grew up in a community that would have been considered the back then. Most people grew some of their food. We never locked our doors. It was small, close-knit community of folks, mostly family, but not all family. People bartered, that kind of thing. And so I think for me, I had never lived in a big city until I went to college in San Antonio, and I just became fascinated with cities. They just work differently than towns, right? Um, but what really drove me to my interest in food was teaching at Coretta Scott King Academy. I taught middle school, sixth and seventh grade, and I had students who suffered from food insecurity. I had a student who was type 2 diabetic, and she was 12 years old. I was maybe 23 when I was teaching. I did not know that someone who was 12 years old could be type 2 diabetic. So I was doing all this research around how is that possible and learning things about the food system. And I had students who then started asking me questions around, why is the grocery store in your neighborhood so much better than the grocery store in our neighborhood? They asked really great questions and I had no answers. So when I decided to go to graduate school, I decided to switch over to studying food instead of I thought I would study education in grad school. But when I got to DC for grad school, I was also grappling with not only my interest in food, but what did it mean to be rooted in a community where I was living and studying, and to contribute back to a city that was giving me so much. Even though I knew I would only be there temporarily, I wanted to think about trying to use research as a change agent right where I was. And so that's pretty much been my praxis since grad school. So I was living in DC. I decided I was going to do research in DC. I left DC. I live in Texas now. I'm doing research in Texas. It's one way to be a good citizen and good community member, in my opinion. So that's how I ended up doing research in DC.
No, that is, I'm going to try not to cry on this, but that was so heartwarming in terms of giving back to a place that was giving so much to you. And so it does make me think about some strategies that you use, like in your book. One that was really fascinating to me, I would say unconventional, but I'm not an anthropologist, so maybe it is conventional. But you talked about using the tool of like nostalgia, and how you were taking in stories and reporting them out and writing through them. So I just wanted you to kind of explain, what is that really, as we're looking right to like study and listen more. How did you use that? How did you come up with it? What did it yield for you?
Yeah. I take a lot of my cues as an anthropologist from one of the greatest writers ever and anthropologist, Zora Neale Hurston. And there's a story I always tell people that when she talks about leaving from school in New York and going back down to Florida, she's going and she's supposed to be collecting stories. She's collecting folklore, and people would not talk to her. And she's like, I don't understand why people won't talk to me. I'm from Florida. These are other Black people. I'm a Black person. Why aren't you talking to me? And she has this moment where she realizes that people are not comfortable talking to her because she says she came down speaking Bardonese because she went from Bard College. And she said it dawned on her that she wasn't talking to the community of folks that she wanted to learn from, like the community of folk that she knew. Like she was bringing all this knowledge, all this stuff, which is great, but people were not connecting with that. And so I take that very seriously. And when it comes to food, there are two things that I deeply believe. One, everybody has a food story, no matter where you are in the world. And yeah. Two, everyone has a really good food memory, no matter where you are in the world. And those two things really guide how I talk to people about food. Before I even say anything around the statistics or what could be wrong in the food environment, let alone asking them anything about their consumption, I ask them to tell me a story about food, a good memory about food. And that's essentially what nostalgia is asking people to reflect and remember on something that like warms their heart. this to me is particularly important for Black and Brown people because of everyone in this nation, our foods are demonized the most. Doesn't matter if you're trying the best that you can. There's already an assumption of Black when we look at statistics, we look at reports about Black folks in food and eating. There's a lot of lack there, and I don't want to reproduce that lack. I'm interested in us understanding how racism and classism shapes the food environment, but I'm also equally interested in how Black folks have used our stories, have used our memories, our recipes, the making a way out of no way, you name it. I'm interested in the ways we remember and we employ those things on a regular basis. That is the basis of self-reliance. If there's nothing else, we've got skills, we got all of that. It's remembering. There's a reason why so many of our ancestors told stories over and over again. That remembering part is really, really important.
And I love that. Did that shape your work differently in terms of, like, I don't know if you came in with a certain thesis statement and then you're like, well, I'm hearing this theme, so like, should I be pivoting? Like, how did that affect your work?
Yeah. So I came in thinking that I was going to do a lot more work in people's kitchens and in their homes. And two things happened. One, a lot of times when I was meeting people, they would prefer to meet out somewhere in public. And so, that's always important to me as a researcher, as an anthropologist, that people are comfortable. And then the second thing is, just by chance, I had spent a lot of time talking to elders first. And I say by chance, but probably not, because old people are my favorite category of people in the entire world. It's just, I could spend all day with someone. If all my friends were 70 plus, I would feel pretty good about that. So I love just sitting and learning and listening from elders. And so in the first 4 months, I spent so much time talking to elders, and they kept saying things like, we used to have more food options, or we used to be a lot more self-reliant, or there used to be a lot more gardens here. Or my personal favorites were the stories of elders talking about how their parents would dig up their fruit trees and plants from the South and bring them with them up to DC, Baltimore, New York, wherever they landed. And those things made me start thinking more about how the way we talk about our memories and our food has an impact on how we experience it as well.
Okay. So that's helpful, and how that shaped you. When you were talking, I thought about something came to my mind. Like, I have questions, but something came to my mind when you were talking about the access. Okay, yes. I really enjoyed that you speak about kind of the shift. You have this page where you have like a graph where it goes from 2010 to 2016, and you can see kind of the delta of grocery stores from wards 1 through 8, for those who are not from the DC area. I always say, like, that's DC's counties, wards 1 through 8. And you kind of see there's a decrease and increase kind of going on within those 6 years. But what's consistent is in both wards 7 and 8, where, Deanwood in your book, Black Food Geographies, takes place, and where we are in Anacostia are right in 7 and 8, there's a decrease, and there's no planned grocery stores. In addition to, not only are we losing, where there's nothing in the pipeline coming. I guess, like, why did you think that was important to include? And also, like, again, trying to get into your head of, like, what was that doing and framing and pulling up for you?
Yeah, so I think it's important. One of the reasons why it's important is because when we're talking about food access in the contemporary moment, not exclusively, but primarily, grocery stores and supermarkets are an indicator that people are looking for in terms of adequate or easy or convenient access. And so in a city like DC that is relatively compact compared to a city like Detroit or something like that. For wards 1 and 3 to have 7 and 10 grocery stores, I can't remember the exact numbers, and then east of the Anacostia River that's serving over 150,000 people to only have 2 and then have nothing planned, that shows you as a reader, as a consumer, that planning out grocery stores isn't about need. It really is about profit and about class. And that's a really important thing for people to understand. And one thing that I always like to say, and I meant to say this at the beginning, I am not, if someone says what they want in a neighborhood is that they need a supermarket or a grocery store because they don't have one, I think there are countless examples of communities who have fought for that, gotten that, and it's been a blessing to their communities. So full stop. I want people to have what they need. But the second thing, and I think this is a part of the important part of y'all's series and the mandates to the church and to the community, is that the over-reliance on corporations, it actually doesn't serve us. And truly, we can look at that beyond food. There really hasn't been a period of time where our over-reliance, Black people's reliance on corporations has really served us in any kind of way. And that's one thing that I wanted to reflect, that ultimately this is still a profit-driven industry. And then I think the second thing that I wanted to sort of show, that chart in addition to the maps that show up in the book, is that some people will say, this is a class issue, this isn't a race issue. But if you directly take a map of class, of race, and of grocery stores and superimpose them on each other for DC, you see it's a race issue, right? There's no way to unlink those things. But it's not just DC. If I've done the same mapping with LA, the same mapping with Detroit, we could do it with Houston, we could do it with Baltimore. The similar thing is true. So if we know that these systems are not designed to feed and nourish people who look like us, then for me, the question is, how do we take that knowledge and imagine and design systems that are for nourishing people who look like us and anyone who actually needs nourishing?
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. You are thinking of, not because sometimes it can be easy to kind of go all the way to the other side and say, well, there are no grocery stores, they don't plan them, let's forget them. But you do acknowledge here and in your book that, well, we have to think about the time we live in and the place, and that is going to be what meets the needs of most people, but still thinking about how to produce ourselves.
It's a both and I think one of the hardest things, in my opinion, is not necessarily just the location of stores, but there's a lot of cultural shifts that have to happen. I mean this on a broader level, because part of the reason why we go to grocery stores and supermarkets is because they're convenient. We don't want to have to go to a lot of different places to get what we need. And so and convenience is an American value. I'm not suggesting it's a good one, but it is deeply embedded in American society. And so to think about the rhythms of planting gardens or farms or eating in season, that requires a different level of intentionality that I think is a first start for trying to get us to think differently around where we might get food, how we might produce food. I have a balcony garden, and then I share a community garden with friends. And even for someone who researches food, I'm like, this is a lot of work. This is a lot of work, and I enjoy it. But the thing that has made the difference for me is doing it in community with other people. Right. I've always had things that I grow on the balcony, but this year is the first year that I'm growing on a plot with other people. And I'm like, oh, this actually eases some of the pressure, right? And just makes it more enjoyable.
Yeah. No, when you were talking, I thought about my neighbors. I'm going to give them a shout out. The Whiskers. They have a garden. They're planting, I know, like green beans and some tomatoes, and they're heading out. And the beauty of us living next door is they're like, hey, can someone water our garden? Because it does need water and it's not going to rain all the time. So that communal piece is very important for us to practice.
And I think I want to just add this thing about the community. I told you I was excited about being invited by a church. I guess I should have also mentioned that my dad's a pastor. So it's like this is one of the things I'm always trying to get him to think about, having his church grow things on their church property. But one of the, it's not just the communal thing of like, oh man, it's so nice that my neighbor will come and water my garden, but it's the interdependency of everything, right? And when we think about our mandates of how to live, interdependency is at the core of it, right? And when we have interdependency on one hand, and we know that's a mandate, and we've got what I would say hyper individuality on the other hand, which is also another American value, then when you think about it, that idea of your neighbor reaching out to you about watering your garden or sharing from garden, that's actually like a radical departure from what like majority of society say we should be doing. And I guess I like to mention that because food is important. It's about the body, it's about the social body, it's about all of that. But there's so many lessons we learn about how to be with people through growing food and through eating together and being mindful of just the ways that, you know, we overconsume, or how we could share all those things. I think like you name a life lesson, and I could talk about how we can learn it through food in some kind of way, right? And you know, when I think about these conversations, I saw the lineup that y'all have. It's a stellar lineup. I saw the lineup, and not one of those conversations is absent from a conversation about interdependency, or how do we do right by each other, you know, as community members, as neighbors, but just as fellow human beings.
Yeah, no, when you said so much of like food can help us relate in life, I think about that's in essence the Bible. So many parables and so much about gardening and planting and yokes and like all of it's in a very agricultural society that it is a disconnect for us to understand a lot of times, because to your point, I talk about with friends all the time, our disconnect with our food also does something about our own consumption of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So like being connected to it will change. I think I agree with you, the way we relate with people and the way we consume from the land and even feel and treat the land that gives us this.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, I think, you know, I was just thinking about how when I'm traveling outside of the US, by and large, not always, it's the agricultural base in so many places is still fairly intact. And I also, you know, I think about how on a policy level in the US, we don't value farmers and producers, right? You know, to be a farmer, of integrity, sometimes means that you yourself are food insecure. Like farmers don't always make a lot of money, and those who do sometimes are, you know, working with government subsidies so that they can grow soy or corn or whatever. And I'm not demonizing them for those things at all. But what I am suggesting is that our US investment in growing food hasn't been about feeding people. And so I think about what shifts if it does. And like, here's an example, like a concrete example. March 2020, we all know what happens. There's a pandemic that breaks out. We don't know how long it's going to last. And for some people, it was the first time they had gone to a grocery store in a supermarket in the US and seen the shelves bare.
Yeah.
And it made people afraid. They saw firsthand, like, oh, this is what it means for us to be so far removed from our food and be dependent on global supply chains, right? And so, in response to that, I think two things happened. Some people started hoarding things, out of fear of scarcity. And then some people started doing things like, what would it look like if I started trying to make more food at home or plant more things? Or, oh, I should find out where my local farmers are. And so some farms and farmers got a boost during the pandemic because more people wanted to be more connected to their food. And what also happened that during this time that I think is sometimes highly neglected, but I think is really relevant, is we start to see like even the earth healing herself more because we are not doing the toxic things that we, do that harm the earth. And so I don't think those things are separate. I think they're intertwined, they're interrelated.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. We some friends that were making fun of like when we drove out in the pandemic, it looked very green and it was very quiet and just the things
Yes.
that exist.
And in some places it like was legit, like verifiably greener. Like, and the air was cleaner and all of these different things. So, I think as we think about food, I mean, we'd be remiss to not think about its connection to global warming and all these other things that are um, connected to mass production. And so being able to think about, I mean, one of the things that I think people rightly ask is like, where do we start? Like, it feels so big to start growing your own food. And my answer to that is, well, you don't have to grow everything. No one grows everything. No farmer grows everything. And even if we look at the examples from Black Food Geographies or just from other like historical examples, so many families grew enough, but they, again, that interdependency thing, they also connected with their neighbors and their communities who grew other things. And
Yeah.
like, let's figure this out. Let's trade together. And so for me, I call those like mini blueprints of resistance, right? Everything doesn't have to scale up so big. Sometimes we just start with where we are, right? Sometimes that looks like, to me, like my friend who our friends who we grow with, they have a 20-month-old daughter. And so to me, yes, we are investing in growing our food, but we're also training Ella to love growing too. She comes out with, I bought her a little watering can that has her name on it. I'm like, come on, Ella, let's water the tomatoes or whatever. We have no idea what we're doing. I mean, we're trying, we're doing our best. But it all starts somewhere. And then let's say you don't want to grow your food. A lot of people don't want to grow food. There are plenty of farmers who would love to have more people buy directly from them. And I am super happy. I don't know the best way to do it, but I can share some resources with how do you link up and find farmers in your area, particularly Black farmers. But yeah, like I think sometimes the bigness can feel, I mean, it can feel overwhelming, and I completely get that. But really, like what we know also from all of the stories, like I'm thinking about the biblical stories, there are so few examples of everything just being right from the beginning, or everything just being like spectacular from the beginning, like who knew that the sea was going to part, right? First thing you had to do was take a step toward it, and then another step and another step and another step. And that's how I think about the food conversation. Our food system didn't get here overnight. And it's going to take a lot from a policy level, from activism, all these different things to change a like big food system. But we also all have mini food systems. We have networks of people. Like even, another thing, someone I saw in the chat was like, let's eat together more. Another suggestion that I tell people is, so much of our food is like, if we're not eating out, then we're kind of eating in our families in silos at home. A few years ago, I started doing a cook share with friends where we each have a meal, we meet up on a Sunday, and we share them for the week. right? And that's another way of thinking about how we answer that question of, I'm too busy to cook or I'm too busy to eat healthy. Well, if we bring more people into the process with us,
Yeah.
then it makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah. No, that's so helpful. I mean, one of the goals for this conversation was to hear really and glean from you, but also to walk away with what are some things that we can do. Hopefully we can take, to your point, it's a lot, but like one or two things and say, hey, for this quarter, for this semester, we're going to do this thing.
Yeah.
And you talking about farmers, and me think about the story where you were talking to the community shop owner. I want to say it was Mr. Jones, and how that interaction was interesting, where you went and introduced yourself, and he's like,
I'm not him.
right. But when you said who you, like, in essence, who connected you, that kind of opened him up. And then you talking about Ella and just like the role he played in the community in terms of like, my question will be really, how do we like support community markets, right? More, you talked about the farmers, and like, should we be encouraging those stores? Because it seemed like he was a gatekeeper where they could go to a Giant or a Safeway, which I love what your chapter is called, the unsafe way.
Yeah.
Go to a Giant or a Safeway and no one regulates. A kid can like buy, I don't know, like 10 bags of candy. No one cares. But those community markets really, him in particular, like the parents would be okay them going because it was a place of safety. He wouldn't let them just buy all the things and say, you know, some candies are fine, but take those others back. And just that role that he played. I think, what did you see from there? And like, is that something that we should be building relationships with our community markets?
1,000% yes to the relationship building. Like, so who I call Mr. Jones in the book, he actually passed away in 2018. So he didn't get to have, he was one of the first people I wanted to have a copy of the book, because, and he was very excited about there being a chapter written about him and the store. What he represents for me is what people often say, which is, back in the day, people used to care about each other where it was okay if you corrected someone else's kids, right? Or you didn't have, it wasn't this like to each their own. And I take that to mean that for some people that feels like a loss, like that we want that. And when I look at that store, I'm like, and it does exist in some places. And here's what I take from it. One, the store had been there for a long time. Two, the owner, he sponsored a little league baseball team. Like, he was always doing stuff in the community to make sure that he was connected to the community, so that his store wasn't just an economic enterprise. It was truly like a community store. So I think that's really important. And then, like, there are other things, like he didn't sell lottery tickets in his store. That was an important part for him. He didn't sell beer in his store. Like, those were some personal choices that he made about the store that I think people respected. But beyond that, the key thing for him was trying to have relationships with people who came in. I would watch kids come in and be corrected by him, and they wouldn't pop off back at him, right? And I mean, I literally maybe a block, but I think it was only half a block down the way. There was a corner store, another store, sign on the door that says no backpacks, only 2 kids in the store at a time. Like, there is already a policing that happens before you get into the door. And I would watch how kids interacted in that store, right? And this is what I believe about people in general. I might be an optimist. Sometimes I'm an optimist. And I think a lot of times, especially with young people know when you care about them or when you don't, and they adjust accordingly. And when I think about how he interacted in the neighborhood, that seemed very clear to me. You know, one of the challenges with there's a few challenges with small stores that I like to mention to people just as context.
Yeah.
Sometimes people say, well, small stores only sell junk food, or they don't sell anything healthy. And I understand where that's coming from. And small stores have a hard time getting contracts often. Like, most of the suppliers want to go to the bigger stores. And so they have a hard time sometimes getting suppliers to want to come there. And so, you know, I like to offer that as a bit of, context, so that so that small stores don't get demonized right off the top, right? There's some unique challenges that I think they face. I think another challenge in DC in particular is that for a lot of small stores, the owners don't live in the neighborhoods, and are not connected to the neighborhoods. And so this means there needs to be some work in getting connected. Like there's some relational work in getting connected. I think also from like a fresh fruits and vegetables perspective, DC has done a really good job with in certain ways with like healthy corners programs, et cetera, to get fresh fruits and vegetables into these smaller stores. And so I think but I think sometimes small stores are overwhelmed. And so it takes like some community members to help them be able to be connected to the right resources to have that kind of option in their store. So I definitely think it's important to be connected. We're talking about store owners, but I think this is true about restaurant owners as well. Even the carryouts, even those kinds of places that we don't necessarily want people to have to get all their meals from, but they're still part of our communities too. So we got to figure that out. So I mentioned farmers already. Yeah, like I just think trying to figure out, some estimates will say that like for communities that don't have a grocery store or supermarket, especially particularly low income communities that don't have supermarkets or grocery stores, people could get upwards of 60-75% of their food from a corner store. And so if we care about those folks who are getting the food from the corner stores, that means that we have to be engaging those stores too. We have to be figuring out ways to like make that a more palatable eating experience, but also shopping experience. Because I have been in some stores in DC where I'm followed in the store. I'm assumed already that like I'm doing something wrong. So like even just doing some of that relational work around that. I mean, there's a lot of deep anti-Blackness in some of these spaces that requires work.
Well, that's marching orders for us for sure. To firstly pray about, and secondly strategize, to study and pursue that. You mentioned a few things that make me think about intersectionality, of just like thinking about food is not in a silo, which I think our conversation shows. You pulled some articles from 1971 and 1982, respectively called "Food Chains Reduced Operations in DC and the Grocery Stores Fight to the Suburbs," where you comment on a gap in food access, a gap in employment, a gap in economic sustainability in the neighborhood. So when you're talking about corner stores and even why that is, it's like the focus is incorrect, right? Because there are all these issues that feed in, right, that are like a part of the food insecurity. So if you could talk about like even, what intersectionalities you found, what you saw in them, we can continue to consider those things.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'll give a little bit more context for people who haven't read the book. So in one of the chapters, I'm trying to trace how do we get to a DC where there are two grocery stores east of the Anacostia River. And it starts well before the 2000s, right? It actually starts to happen like in the mid 60s, early 70s, where middle class people, white people are obviously they're moving out to the suburbs. Commerce is following them in general, not just supermarkets. We also have the rise of the strip mall in the 70s and the 80s. And then you start to have whereas grocery stores in like the 1930s used to be around 6,000, maybe 6,000. If you were lucky, 9,000 square feet, they were really small. We now live in an age where a supermarket is well over 80,000 square feet. Or if you have like a super Target or a super Walmart, those are over, they can be 200, 250,000 square feet. So like there's this huge sizing up. Well, what happens when you size up? You need more space. And so one of the things that was happening was corporations were saying, we need more space. Land in the city is expensive. We have to go to the suburbs because it's more affordable to build out there. Speaking of intersectionality, this is also a time where poor people are starting to get further stigmatized because corporations will also say, we can't function in the city because people steal. And the insurance it costs for us to run this business in the city is too high. So we have to go to the suburbs. So you have this drain, not only of people, you have a drain of food resources, but then you also have a drain of taxes. The tax base declines very rapidly in DC between 1970 and about 1990s, where you start to see a little bit of uptick, but it's really not to the 2000s where it starts to really stabilize more. So you've got all of these dynamics that are happening at the same time. You've got the infamous crack epidemic that is happening in the 80s. DC is one of the cities that's hard hit by it. And you've got the ways that Black mothers in particular are being just trashed, all from the president's office all the way down. And you've got an assault that has never quite ended, honestly, on welfare and public benefits. So all this stuff is happening within a 20-30 year period, right? And there's this great book, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's called Feeding the Crisis, if anyone is interested in the ways social services have failed us over time in relation to food. It's a fantastic book. She traces everything. I was just kind of blown away by it. So all of that stuff is happening in DC. I mean, it's not just DC, but it's happening in DC. And then you've got a public education crisis. So, and you've got housing crises. You've got all of these things that are happening, and we're still seeing happening. So what I like to tell people is, if you find me a food insecure neighborhood, it is, I am willing to bet my money that you have also found one of the most policed neighborhoods. You have probably also found a neighborhood with some of the lowest performing schools. And you have probably also found a neighborhood that, if not is in a housing crisis, is on the verge of having something related to housing. That's one of the reasons why we can't just look at, and one of the reasons why this series is so great, that yes, I'm talking about food, but I am sandwiched in between people who are talking about other things, because you're trying to think holistically around how these things go together.
Right.
So yeah, I mentioned the kids I taught in Atlanta. I taught at a Title I low income school. So them asking me about, why is your grocery store so nice? These were also students who were moved from their homes and relocated because all of the public housing units were torn down in Atlanta. And this is happening in the middle of them also trying to go to school. So those, I wish we lived in a society that truly took seriously the infrastructure that we need for people to live whole, healthy lives, but we don't. And so that's not me giving up on fighting for that, but it is also acknowledging the reality of that, and then and so for me, it makes me think about, so how do we fill the gaps? And then sometimes it feels like a lot to fill, but I don't know. I love, a lot of the activist circles that I'm connected to, oftentimes we just say we all we got. And if that's true, then it's okay, what do we build with what we have?
No, I mean, I think this is so important because it reminds us that it is a big issue.
Yeah.
Something that I was surprised to come across in your book was grief, actually. With one of now learning that the character you call Mr. Jones, real man, passed away, but also there's another young man, I believe a 26-year-old father, Kalon, who is pretty much in all of chapter 2, who passes away and also does not get to just see this work. And it had nothing to do with food insecurity, but just showing that us focusing on food is not siloed to that, but it is a bigger problem that if we can even chip something little here, it's a bigger change.
Yeah, I think we're all like just, we're called and tasked with doing our part of the work. And I think we have to believe that there are other people who believe deeply in being called and tasked with doing their part of the work too, as a part of that interdependence. And you mentioned Kaylin, who I call Kaylin in the book. And, for the context for the audience, he passes away, but he's murdered. He's murdered on the streets of DC. He is a formerly incarcerated, mid-20s Black man who was doing work in the food justice space. And, by many accounts, trying to like do right, live the life that he wants to live. And he's doing the work of food justice in the community where he grew up and all this kind of stuff. And, his life is taken away from him. And so like for me, that brought, back into stark relief that like doing good work in one area does have an impact, and it doesn't erase these other kind of challenges that people are living with, including like trying to figure out how to live a good, decent life after making some mistakes earlier in his life, and comes out and he's like, I want my kid to eat well. I don't want her eating candy all the time. I want, and really, put effort behind the things that he wanted to see happen. But like, structurally, there were still things that within the community where he grew up that were not, they're not life-giving, Yeah.
Yeah. And before we go to audience questions, I did, even talking about Kaylin, I wanted to, first, it was really cool to read about the Black Panthers and Black Food Matters, and just, talking about their food program. That's not often a group that we're taught. I grew up in PG County, predominantly Black space, and I can't tell you, I remember really learning about like the Black Panthers, but I'm glad that we are learning about them. So there are a few things I want to connect and just get your perspective on, like why you all thought that was really important to include in the book. Is first, you start off interestingly and you link like ancestry of the enslaved people, the Africans that were brought here, right, against their will, to like something they don't tell us as well is that they had agricultural knowledge that they came and used to employ in growing things like rice here, into taking us into the Black Panthers and the program that they had, knowing that, and I think I had the quote, but they understood that we can't just fight for justice if people are hungry, and that being like the bedrock of just like what they did, and how we know how that ends up turning out. What was your thought process as you all were kind of editing and putting that in, that you wanted your audience to take away?
Yeah, I think, Black Panthers are a really good example of trying to think through, like, they had a whole 10-point plan for how to, like, better the lives of Black folks. But I also think they're a really good example of just like practical everyday things. Like they would borrow kitchens from churches, in California, especially on Sundays, Seventh-day Adventist churches, because they, the kitchens were free, and they would come and they would prepare food. I also like to point out that, sometimes we think about food and cooking, we have a gendered idea of it always being women, but there were a lot of men who were doing this work. So that was, that was really important. And then also we know this work was important. This kind of feeding families, but specifically feeding children, was important because the U.S. government, steals the idea and makes, the pre-K
free reduced
food, program for public schools. So we know it was a great idea. We know that there's something really important about this. I think what was important to us in Black Food Matters overall was showing the different scales at which we can be involved. Black Panthers national organization, chapters all over. Like that's a pretty large scale.
Yeah.
But then you've got, a chapter that Hannah Garth writes where she's focused on one organization in LA. And then there's a chapter that I write that's more historical, but I'm focused on mobile food vendors in the 1930s and 40s in DC. And so what we wanted to, and then there's another chapter I think by Jillian Greaves that is about like food, like she has a section about whole hog killing in South Carolina as a tradition, as a cultural ritual, and so like there are all these different ways that people were trying to explore food in Black life. But I think probably more importantly than that, we wanted to show both problems and solutions that people have offered through time. And I think, I saw a question in the chat around where do people start? There's so many starting places. It could be your personal gardens or your personal commitments to how you want to grow food. Personally, I think like the more communal the practice, sometimes the easier it is. So maybe a community garden. On a church level, y'all may or may not have already engaged with the Black Church Food Security Network. But they're amazing. The Black Church Food Security Network was started by Pastor Heber Brown, and he goes around and helps people start gardens at their churches or on land that is owned by their churches or people who are connected to their churches. And it's a network of 150 churches at this point, which is, and you know how he started? He started by driving food around Baltimore in his church van. So, like he had no idea that it was going to necessarily grow to this size or this network, but he saw a problem after Freddie Gray was murdered, which was that huge parts of Baltimore didn't have access to food because stores had been closed down. And so he started calling people, asking people that he knew, like, what do you have so that we can, and they set up a distribution center at their church once things got too big because people kept calling the church, asking for food. And so he started driving around getting it. And then he started setting up more requests were coming in. So he was like, can people drop off food at the church? And it just, he found a calling in doing that. So, maybe it's something like that. I know so many churches have food banks. But I'll tell you one of these most beautiful moments I had recently. I was in Delaware for a family reunion for a different project that I'm working on. And the family had a lot of food left over and they said, we want to donate it. And I was like, sure, I'll take it to wherever you want. They tell me the name of the place to take it. I take it. And it is very clearly, like it's a food bank / community kitchen. But what I loved about it is that they had there were place settings set up for everyone, like it was treated like real mealtime, not just like assembly line, just let me throw some food on your plate, grab it, sit down, get out. They had set up the place with such a warm, inviting atmosphere that I was just so moved by it, because I think oftentimes unhoused or food insecure or poor people are not treated with dignity and respect. And that goes so far for people, and I just love that. And I love that the volunteers they were excited to do it. So even just thinking about not just the question of how do we feed people and feed ourselves, but how do we make people feel whole?
I love that. How do we make people feel whole? Yeah, that's definitely something we talk a lot about. Not, kind of carrying on that savior complex. Sometimes that's easy to do and make it feel like you're bringing a solution, but treating people with dignity and they have choice and agency and all of that. So that is helpful. I did want to throw out, I don't know if people had questions, but if you have questions, put them in the chat. Otherwise, I have a couple of more questions for you, Dr. Reese. I'll give people a few. I'll ask one while I give. Hopefully, we can get one from the audience. You talk a little bit about. You mentioned your co-author Hannah Garth and the program that she was with in South LA, or say Southeast LA, and she talked specifically. I think it was an interesting anecdote where they asked like, "What's your favorite food?" And she says mac and cheese, and someone talked to her at the end, pretty much saying like, "Why would you say that? That's not healthy." And so, clear anti-Blackness in that. So what, I guess, can you help us? Because like I would think, some of us might think, yeah, that's probably not the healthiest thing, and then how do we reframe our minds and not thinking the foods that we know traditionally to be, unhealthy?
Yeah, this is such a great story. That's one of the anecdotes I tell all the time, Hannah's story, because this is why I like to use the word nourishment instead of healthy. Because I think there are many ways that we're nourished, and not just biologically, culturally, socially, spiritually. There's so many ways, and food is like a center connector of all of those different ways. So let me ask you, what is your favorite food?
Oh, that's really easy. I'm Cameroonian, so honestly, my favorite food is fufu and eru. So probably people know fufu. It's made with cassava for us. It's fermented in water and all the things. Eru is a green that's grown in West Africa, Central West Africa. So that's my all-time favorite.
I love that. Now, imagine someone starts to tell you every single day, this is not good for you. I don't care that you love this. I don't care that you have memories attached to this. The things that are healthy are these things that we put on this chart that say this is what healthy eating is. So here's one thing I also like to tell people. People be like, eat fruits and vegetables, that's healthy. Well, do you know how many people in America, regardless of race, actually get whatever the required amount of fruits and vegetables? Less than a third. Like most people are not eating, the recommended amounts. That's not to say it's right, but it is to put it in context that like we're not the only people who are not just out here eating, lettuce all day. So I think that's really important. The other thing I want to say is that there is a very real tension between the fact that we know that some illnesses are diet related, and we don't want to be out here policing people's food consumption. That is a really challenging thing. And so one of the things I often suggest is that instead of thinking about an either or, it really is a both and. For most people, not barring like real reasons why something might be need to be completely cut out of someone's diet, most of us don't need to cut out everything that we know and love from our childhood. I like to think about an additive model. Like, I use this example for my own life. Like, I didn't grow up eating Brussels sprouts, didn't know what Brussels sprouts were. Now I love Brussels sprouts, right? I'm like, someone introduced me to Brussels sprouts and I'm like, cool. This is great. I can eat this, Or like, my favorite food is tacos.
Ooh.
I'm a Texan, and I think Texas makes the best tacos, and I love them. All right. And I could eat tacos every single day. But I think one of the things that I have to try to be mindful of is like, all right, well, if I have a breakfast taco, I probably shouldn't have a lunch and a dinner taco, right? And like just trying to make these negotiations. So basically what I'm saying is there like this on an individual level, there's some level of intentionality that we must have around how we're making decisions around what we're going to eat. The other thing that I think is important to this conversation, just on a structural level, is our food system and our food labeling systems are not designed for us to be smart consumers.
Speak on it.
And so I say that to remind us that it's not individuals who are failing. It
Mhm.
is we are operating in a system that doesn't set us up for success, basically.
Mhm.
So, in terms of an individual level, I'm a big fan of planning out meals. I think it is helpful for, I, 10 out of 10 times, if I planned out my meals, I'm probably going to have a better food week than I had before, without doing that. I mean, yeah, I'm like, I love to use this example. My mother, when I was in grad school, I was vegan by choice for a bit, and but the one thing that I would allow myself, my mother used to make these cookies that she would mail to me in the mail. Um, and the reason why I loved it is because she was in Texas, I was in DC. I loved it because I grew up in a low income working class family. And so I'm in grad school, doing this middle class thing and climbing the ranks. And those treats that she would make me became this form of connection that was more important to me than being like a hardline vegan, honestly.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that was a personal choice that I made, and it made sense to me. But in a world where my class status and all this stuff was changing, and I'm still trying to stay connected to my mother and still wanting her to feel like that there is something that she could offer me by
Yeah.
way of feeding me. Because when I would go home, she would say, I don't know what to cook for you. Right. Then
Mhm.
which was true, Yeah, I
Mhm.
remember one time she was very proud of herself because she made greens and she was like, I think I made them vegan. I was like, all right. She's like, yeah, I didn't use pork. I used turkey or something. I was like, cool. That's a step in the right direction. But like, it's the effort, right? It was the effort. And
Yeah.
that's what really, really mattered. It mattered to me that she cared enough around the choices that I was making to try to make an effort.
Mhm.
And it mattered to me enough that she put all this labor and care into trying to offer connection to me through something that she baked. I was like, I'll eat these cookies. And it also just reminded me of home. Sometimes we need a taste of home, especially when we're far, And so I don't think there's anything wrong with those things. I think it's just us needing to figure out how to balance it all. It's a little bit of give and take.
I love that. I heard you speak about that. The tea cakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. For her birthday, her 70th birthday, I framed these photos that I took of her when she was baking for me one day, when I was home while I was in grad school. So I just, I think there's a way that we have to think both and not either or.
Mhm.
I also am not a fan of people eating things they don't like.
Mm.
There are hundreds, thousands of combinations of things. Like, for example, even when I do eat vegan, I don't like soy-based products. But you know what? There are so many other kinds of cuisines from around the world
Mhm.
that are already vegan or vegetarian without me having to add soy. So I just don't add soy, right? So it does take a little bit more effort. But I'm like, no, eating healthy doesn't mean that you only have to have carrots and Brussels sprouts or broccoli and lettuce on your plate. I think what it means is trying to figure out, what do I need to consume that helps me feel good in my body?
Mhm. No, thank you so much. I think the last two questions I have here for you, when you're looking at DC, the Black community in DC in particular, what gives you hope?
Oh, so many things. I love thinking about the really good work that so many organizations are doing in DC, so many grassroots organizations. I think y'all are hearing from one today. Are y'all hearing from Plant DC? After me, a resource, hearing about a resource.
Yes.
Yeah, that I love hearing about schools that start gardens. That makes me happy in general. I think I mean, kids really like growing things overall. So I love hearing about that. There was a group of community people in Ward 7 and Ward 8, and I've got disconnected in the middle of the pandemic, who were really trying to organize to open a food co-op. So I'm encouraged by that. People who like get together and try to figure out a solution. And honestly, like I'm not just saying this to say it. I truly am deeply hopeful about the work that y'all are doing. Like, I think it is not a small thing to think about how to be a good steward of your collective resources. And I know that that is like a basic call of the church. And we know that there are a lot of examples of churches and other organizations that are not good collective stewards of their resources, which includes not just bringing people in here, but how do we get out there?
Right.
And be out there regardless of if people decide to come in here. I think that's really important.
No, I would say we stand on that, going out for sure, and it not being contingent upon people's responses. What we are tasked to do. That's helpful. What advice do you have for us as a church as we seek to address food security in our neighborhood? And I know you've said some things, but if you have like a last thought on that.
I'm going to combine this with a couple of questions that I saw in the chat. Someone asked about how do we engage communities to tell us what they need? And then someone asked, what do you suggest in a city like DC, where you have all these resources, so as not to recreate them? I think those are two really great questions that feed into the advice that I would have. The first one is really trying to understand the landscape of resources in DC. The person who posed the question is right. There's so many resources in DC. So trying to understand at what level are people, because some of the resources are really about policy. So that's, it's great, but it's not really what you're trying to do. Some are about direct services and goods to people, which might be something that you're interested in, trying to see like what's working, what's not working with folks. And then some are really like building infrastructure, like more gardens and stuff like that. So I think you have to decide where you want to fit. Direct services, building gardens, policy, a little bit of all three, and then figure out where the resources are. I think the second thing is you got to know your community. You got to know who you're including. When you say community, who do you imagine?
Yeah.
And then once you've imagined those people, what do they have to say about their own needs? So one of the questions was around like, some people are homeowners, some are renters, some have vehicles. And I think those things are important, and let them tell you why they're important, how those things influence where they go. I'm happy, if I still have it, I think I do. I'm happy to send you the questions that I used for my survey for the book, because it helped people be able to tell me what they loved about the community, their food in their community, what they didn't like. Like that comment about the unsafe way came directly from someone saying, this is what we call it. And I'm like, yes, that is brilliant. That is also what I'm going to call it. So I think as much as, and I don't want to pretend like that doesn't take time. It does take time. But I think it's time well spent, because what we also know is that there are a lot of resources wasted because people are creating programs for the problems they think exist versus talking to people and finding out what they actually need. The last thing I'm going to say is directly related to elders. There's a lot of research focused on children and food insecurity, and that makes a lot of sense. But we have an aging population that is about to be larger than any, 65 plus population that we've had in US history.
Yeah.
And so many elders are isolated for a number of reasons. Partner or spouse may have passed away, their friends have passed away, or they're home ridden or whatever. And so I think there is this particular need to understand what elders experience as challenging and what they what they would like to see happen. I know just anecdotally from my own experience, I used to live in between an 84-year-old and a 76-year-old when I lived in Atlanta. And the thing that they needed the most was for me to go shopping for them or to take them to the store or just pick stuff all the time. And I imagine that that is not uncommon. Neither one of them drove cars, right? And so that was really important. So I think paying particular attention to the elders in the room. As far as not reproducing what other organizations are doing. So I have two minds about this. Sometimes reproduction is good because sometimes you might be doing the same thing, but you're doing it for a different population, or that population connects with you differently from another resource. So I think just trying to think about where the overlap is and why, and being intentional about that why matters. The other thing that I think about resource kind of replication is that this is a question of scale. Everything becomes a question of scale to me at some point. You could be working, community means a lot of things. It could be neighborhood, it could be ward level, it could be city level, it could be a lot of things. And so like an organization like Bread for the City, for example, is working at a pretty high level. So you might reproduce some of the stuff that they're doing, but people who are right in your immediate community and neighborhood may not be connected to those services, may not even know that they exist. And so you still might be able to do it on a smaller scale and still have a large impact, if that makes sense. So I think just, figuring out what scale you want to operate, figuring out in what ways, direct service, like handing out food. Do you want to teach people in your community how to garden? Do you want to start gardens? And then lastly, I just really hope y'all connect with Heber Brown and the Black Church Food Security Network. I think their work is amazing.
Thank you so much. Well, food security team, I know there's some on here, so we're taking notes. We'll make sure to connect there. This has been an absolute pleasure, Dr. Ashanté Reese. Thank you for taking out your time. Thank you for your over 3 years. I know just 3 years you spent with the people, listening and investing and pouring in to produce these works for us that we desperately need, and has been really helpful for our context. And just even giving us your time here to tease some of these things out. We couldn't get, there's so much. I'm like, I have so many questions.
I know and you're such a great conversation partner. So I hope people are also giving you a shout out for just leading us in really good conversation. I will also just mention, I don't know if there's like follow-ups that come after this, but on my website, I have a food justice reading list if people want to look at it. My website is www.amreese.com, and then you'll see there's some readings under resources. And then this might be a book. I know the food security team is reading already. This might be another book of interest. It's called The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice. And it's written by a religious studies professor who is basically connecting the Christian ethic to food and race, mostly in the U.S. But so please, if people have more questions, I'm public everywhere. You can find me on Twitter, on UT Austin's website. Happy to answer more things if it's helpful. But I can't wait to see what you all do in your community.
We'll definitely keep you posted. Thank you so much, Dr. Reese.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for joining that conversation. I am Takor Njang, and I'm going to hand this right back over to our amazing deaconess, Hannah Baker.
Tano, thank you so very much for leading us through tonight's conversation. Food access and security is such an intimate and embodied issue, touching all of our lives in different ways. And so we really appreciate your wisdom and leading us through. And we're so glad to have a new friend in Dr. Ashanté Reese. So thank you, Tano.
Hannah.
Fam, please show Tano some love as she leaves. Thanks again, Tano. As we consider our own foodways and those of our neighbors here in Southeast, I want to highlight a resource partner doing work in the area of food justice. DC Greens is a Black-led, multiracial organization that uses the power of equitable food policy, education, and access to build a more just and resilient food system here in DC. Their vision for health equity is a city where everyone has the ability to shape the policies and institutions that have an impact on well-being. DC Greens believes that our communities have the right to self-determine their relationship with food. They work with DC residents experiencing food insecurity to build power using tools and strategies to influence the production, accessibility, and affordability of nutritious foods. Their key programmatic pillars position them to advance health equity in collaboration with community members, peer organizations, and partners in government. DC Green's produce prescription program advances a food as medicine approach. The team equips medical professionals to prescribe fresh fruits and veggies to patients with lower incomes, managing diet-related illnesses such as diabetes, prediabetes, and hypertension. Here in Ward 8, DC Green's farm and intergenerational wellness space, The Well at Oxen Run, is the latest community health intervention, a place-based endeavor that promotes healing and health and healthy green space, as well as programs that address the root causes of food insecurities. Some ways that we can support the work of DC Greens. Pray for the work. In addition to their food access work, they are also working on a local level to change policies related to institutional food access, including changing nutritional standards for incarcerated citizens through the Fresh Starts Act and advocating for universal free school meals. Study. Learn more about food access issues here in DC. Reading Black Food Geographies is a great place to start. And act. We can volunteer at The Well at Oxen Run. Saturday community volunteer hours are from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. each week. You can learn more information about DC Greens or sign up to volunteer at dcgreens.org. Now, to the winner of a signed copy of Black Food Geographies, Race, Self-Reliance, and Food Access in Washington, D.C. by Ashanté M. Reese. Maura Ballard, congratulations. The Ballard household is having a winning streak. Pastor Tim won last week. So congratulations. We'll have this book for you on Sunday at church. That brings us to the end of tonight's discussion. Thanks for tuning in to Conversations on Blessing the Block. Join us next time, which will be on August 10th at a special time, 6 p.m. as our brother Michael Gromley moderates session 4, Marry and Have Children. He'll be discussing the book Torn Apart, how the child welfare system destroys Black families and how abolition can build a safer world, with author Dorothy Roberts. Thanks to Anacostia River Church for hosting this conversation and your desire to plant gardens and eat in this community. Thanks again to our guests, Dr. Ashanté Reese. Thanks to Pastor Babatunde, and thanks to tonight's moderator, Takor Njang. Thanks as always to our producer, Astrid Hacker. On behalf of Anacostia River Church, where I get to serve as Deaconess of Community Development, my name is Hannah Baker. Let's bless the block together, fam. Good night.